The US government is backing yet another coup attempt in Venezuela. In the past 2 decades, Washington has sponsored several coup attempts, many of which were violent, trying to overthrow Venezuela's government, the former revolutionary president Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolas Maduro. Back in 2002, the US government backed a military coup that briefly overthrew Venezuela's democratically elected left-wing president, Hugo Chavez. This was admitted even by the mainstream British newspaper, The Guardian, which revealed that the Bush administration, George W. Bush, backed this coup in Venezuela, but it only lasted for 2 days, and the people of Venezuela flooded the streets, and they overthrew the coup regime and reinstalled in power Chavez, who continued the Bolivarian revolution that he started. So this story is not new. There have been so many US-backed coup attempts in Venezuela just in the past few years. On July 28th, Venezuela held presidential elections, and Maduro won those elections again. However, the US and its allies in Latin America have refused to recognize the results, and instead, violent extremists are burning down public institutions and government buildings and hospitals. They're destroying buses and looting offices, trying to overthrow President Maduro. And these extremists have the support of some very powerful people, like the billionaire oligarch Elon Musk, who is now campaigning for Donald Trump for president. And of course, Elon Musk, in addition to being CEO of Tesla, which has received billions of dollars of subsidies from the US government, he also is the owner of Twitter, now known as X.com. And Musk has been sharing loads of disinformation on Twitter, fake news, deceiving people about what's going on in Venezuela. And he is pretty openly calling for overthrowing President Maduro. Now, honestly, this is not very surprising because Elon Musk has a history of supporting US-backed coups in Latin America. In 2019, violent far-right extremists overthrew Bolivia's democratically elected left-wing president, Evo Morales, and the US backed this coup, and so did Elon Musk. And a critic on Twitter called out Elon Musk, and he said, quote, "You know what wasn't in the best interest of the people? The US government organizing a coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia so you could obtain the lithium there. Bolivia has some of the world's largest reserves of lithium, which is needed for electric vehicles made by Tesla, the batteries in electric vehicles, the batteries in phones and cameras and computers. It's very important." And what was Elon Musk's response back in 2020? On Twitter, he said, quote, "We will coup whoever we want. Deal with it." And now, 4 years later, we can see that Musk is being very consistent and supporting yet another coup in Latin America, this time in Venezuela. And the main tactic that extremists in Venezuela are using to try to justify this coup attempt is they're claiming that there was electoral fraud. And I published an investigation in which I show in great detail how the allegations of supposed electoral fraud originate with a firm in the US in New Jersey that is very closely linked to the US government and even linked to the CIA. This is a polling firm called Edison Research that works for US government propaganda organs, and these are propaganda organs that were created by the CIA. As I'll show today, there is no evidence of electoral fraud, but this is not stopping billionaire oligarchs who are closely linked to the US government, like Elon Musk, from sharing this discredited disinformation, including Elon Musk personally shared this exit poll done by the CIA-linked, US government-linked firm. So we can see that when Musk threatened, quote, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it," they really mean it. They're trying it again. Today, I'm going to be analyzing the evidence that shows how completely wrong this narrative is. And before I get into great detail, I want to look at a few comments that were made by some of the independent international electoral observers who were on the ground in Venezuela. One of these groups is actually from the US. They're an independent group called the National Lawyers Guild, and as their name suggests, they consist of lawyers coming from the US. And they had a delegation of 5 US lawyers who were on the ground in Venezuela, and they said very clearly, I'm reading from their press release, quote, "The delegation observed a transparent, fair voting process with scrupulous attention to legitimacy, access to the polls, and pluralism." They said, despite the soundness of the electoral process, the US-backed opposition, with support from an anti-Maduro Western press, has refused to accept the results, undermining the stability of Venezuela's democracy. And this delegation of lawyers from the US said that they, quote, strongly condemn these attacks on the electoral system, as well as the role of the US in undermining the democratic process. Similar comments were made by another independent international electoral observer, the human rights activist Ajamu Baraka, and he tweeted, quote, "I am in Venezuela as an observer and can say with certainty that after systematic interference by anti-democratic forces in the US, the election results represented the sentiments of the people who voted. What is not being reported is the organizing that took place to win." And he talks about how Maduro was able to win the election because he had the support from a progressive social bloc of unions, parties, student groups, women organizations, and they all moved in one common organized direction. And he said, with organization, you can resist moneyed interests, the big oligarchs and corporations that are trying to retake control of Venezuela. We can see this clearly in the response of the right-wing governments in Latin America that are controlled by oligarchs and big corporations and banks. An example of this is Argentina's far-right president Javier Milei, who's extremely pro-US, extremely pro-Israel. Immediately after coming to office, Milei took a trip to Israel to support Benjamin Netanyahu as he carries out horrific crimes in Gaza. And Milei is, of course, a close ally of Donald Trump. They have repeatedly talked in coordinated policy. And Javier Milei is a close friend of Elon Musk, who is joining him in backing this coup attempt in Venezuela. And on Twitter, the Argentine president openly called on the military in Venezuela to overthrow President Maduro. So quite literally, he and other far-right leaders in Latin America, backed by big US corporations and banks, they're calling for a military coup in Venezuela. And I should point out, by the way, that Milei is closely collaborating with the CIA. This is not hidden. He boasts about it. The director of the CIA, William Burns, visited Argentina. He visited the presidential palace, and Milei's chief of staff went to Washington and Virginia, and he also met with the CIA. And in addition to collaborating with the CIA, Milei made an agreement for Israel's spy agency, the Mossad, to train Argentine intelligence officers. So quite literally, the CIA, Israel's Mossad, and the far right in Latin America are all openly collaborating. They're not hiding it. In fact, the current leader of the far right opposition in Venezuela is the extremist Maria Corina Machado. And she, in 2018, published a letter, an open letter on her Twitter account, in which she asked the former right-wing president of Argentina, the multimillionaire Mauricio Macri, and she asked Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's far-right prime minister, for a military intervention in Venezuela to overthrow President Maduro. I mean, they really don't hide it. It's so incredible. You don't have to be an investigative journalist to find some of this stuff. It's on their Twitter account. And this is the extremist, Machado, who the US is currently backing to try to install in power in Venezuela. And there could not be a starker contrast between these far-right Venezuelan extremists like Maria Corina Machado, who love Israel and the US, and on the other hand, the leftist Chavista movement and people like President Nicolas Maduro, who have been huge supporters of Palestine, some of the world's biggest supporters of Palestine. Maduro always speaks in support of Palestine. He broke off diplomatic relations with Israel. And then there, of course, is the geopolitical angle, because while the US and right-wing governments in Latin America that are run by oligarchs, they have refused to recognize Venezuela's electoral results. However, the left-wing governments in Latin America have recognized Venezuela's electoral results. And in addition, China, Russia, and Iran have come out recognizing Maduro. So once again, as we see with so many conflicts in the world, the US is trying to turn this into a proxy war in this new Cold War. And the US is trying to isolate any countries that have an independent foreign policy and ultimately try to overthrow their government. Geopolitics is a big element because ever since the beginning of the leftist Bolivarian revolution started by President Hugo Chavez when he came to power in 1999, Venezuela has tried to pursue a multipolar foreign policy, try to build a multipolar world. Venezuela has formed close ties with China and Russia and Iran. Venezuela has built regional institutions to try to integrate Latin America politically and economically through things like the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, and the Bolivarian Alliance, the ALBA. Venezuela tried to challenge the hegemony of the US dollar and help to create a new currency for Latin America to trade so they don't have to use the US dollar. And then, of course, there's the issue of natural resources. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, and not just that, they were nationalized, and they now belong to the people of Venezuela, overseen by a state-owned company, PDVSA, and Hugo Chavez kicked out all of the US oil corporations. So Donald Trump, when he was president, he tried to oversee a coup to overthrow Venezuela's government, and in 2023, he admitted that the US wanted to take over Venezuela and pillage its oil.
Venezuela. How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
And furthermore, Donald Trump's neoconservative national security advisor, John Bolton, likewise admitted in an interview on Fox News that the Trump administration was working with US oil corporations that wanted to profit from exploiting Venezuela's oil.
We're looking at the oil assets. That's the single most important income stream to the government of Venezuela. We're looking at what to do to that. We're in conversation with major American companies now that are either in Venezuela or, in the case of Citgo, here in the United States. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela.
Of course, you all probably remember the US coup attempt that Donald Trump launched in 2019, in which Washington recognized a little-known right-wing opposition figure, Juan Guaido, as the supposed president of Venezuela, despite the fact that he had never participated in a presidential election. And the fact that this was a coup attempt is not even hidden. It was Donald Trump's neoconservative national security advisor, John Bolton, who, by the way, was one of the architects of the Iraq War. And he boasted in an interview on CNN that he had experience organizing coups, and he named Venezuela as an example of somewhere he had experience organizing coups.
One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work.
I do want to ask a follow-up. When we were talking about what is capable, what you need to do to be able to plan a coup, and you cited your expertise having planned coups.
I'm not going to get into the specifics, but
successful coups?
Well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful.
Now, that coup attempt obviously failed. Juan Guaido never came even remotely close to power in Caracas. But today, the U.S. is backing basically the same strategy under the Democrats now, under Joe Biden, that Trump did. And instead of Juan Guaido, the U.S. is refusing to recognize Maduro and is backing the far-right extremist Maria Corina Machado, who has repeatedly called on the U.S. and Israel to militarily intervene to overthrow Venezuela's government. And she's doing this in collaboration with a man that people are jokingly calling the Joe Biden of Venezuela. His name is Edmundo Gonzalez. He is a right-wing oligarch. He is not popular at all. And in fact, he barely even speaks. It's obvious that the real force behind him is Machado, who is this far-right extremist who has been backed by the US government for many years. Machado has led opposition organizations and right-wing political parties that have been funded with millions of dollars from the US government. And she's such a close ally of Washington that US President George W. Bush personally invited her to the White House in 2005 for a one-on-one meeting. This is the extremist US puppet that the US is trying to install in power in Venezuela yet again. Now, I want to briefly go through some of the recent history of the many US-backed coup attempts in Venezuela. I mentioned that in 2002, the George Bush administration backed a briefly successful military coup that overthrew democratically elected President Hugo Chavez. After the military physically removed Chavez from power, a right-wing millionaire businessman who was the head of the Chamber of Commerce in Venezuela, named Pedro Carmona, declared himself so-called president, despite the fact that he was not elected. And the US government supported him because this is what Washington wants. They want oligarchs in control of Venezuela who will sell off Venezuela's natural resources to US corporations. They don't care about democracy at all. And the Guardian newspaper revealed that the Bush administration was involved in this coup, and in particular, it named some of the former Ronald Reagan administration officials who oversaw the CIA war on Central America in the 1980s, in particular on the revolutionary Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Some of these war criminals were brought back, including the convicted criminal Elliot Abrams, who was a key figure involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. And then when Donald Trump came to power, he brought back this literal convicted criminal, Elliot Abrams, to oversee the Venezuela coup attempt. In January 2019, right as the Trump administration was launching this coup attempt in Venezuela, Donald Trump named notorious neoconservative Elliot Abrams as his special envoy for Venezuela. And he reused some of those same tactics that the CIA used against Nicaragua in the 1980s, this time in Venezuela. But like I said, the 2019 Trump administration coup attempt against Venezuela was simply the latest in a long line. In fact, going back to the very first election that Nicolás Maduro won in 2013, US-backed right-wing opposition forces in Venezuela have always refused to recognize the election results. In 2013, they also claimed supposedly that there was fraud. And of course, they had no evidence, just like they're claiming fraud once again today. And these coup attempts backed by the US have often been very violent. After Hugo Chavez died in 2013, and then Nicolás Maduro won the election in 2013 and became president. Then in 2014, there was another violent US-backed coup attempt, and far-right extremists began burning government buildings, attacking Chavistas, left-wingers, and they created these notorious barricades that were known as guarimbas. And these were not peaceful protesters, although the Western media falsely claimed they were. They were armed, usually with mortar cannons. There were some who had guns, but many of them instead had these makeshift cannons that are known as morteros. And these things are extremely lethal. They're not non-violent protesters. Many people lost their lives because of these far-right extremists shooting left-wing supporters of the government, Chavistas as they're known. Average people, average families in Venezuela lived in terror for many months in 2014 during these violent US-backed riots. And one of the main leaders of this US-backed coup attempt was the far-right extremist Leopoldo Lopez, who is from one of the richest oligarch families in Venezuela. And you know who the other main leader of this US-backed coup attempt was? Once again, Maria Corina Machado, who is so close to the US government, she was invited to the White House for a one-on-one meeting with George Bush. And she is the US puppet that the Biden administration is trying to put in power today. So these same coup leaders in Venezuela come back again and again and again. And meanwhile, the US government and its mouthpieces in the Western media absurdly claim that Venezuela is a so-called dictatorship. Meanwhile, all of these coup plotters who have participated in violent attempts to overthrow the government, they're not in prison. They're walking around free, like Machado. If these extremists carried out these kinds of actions and coup attempts in the US, they would be in prison. But in the so-called dictatorship in Venezuela, they're all walking around free because Venezuela is not a dictatorship. I thought it was very important to talk about some of these details about the US-backed coup attempt in Venezuela, and I wanted to provide its historical context because this is by no means the first time the US has backed a coup attempt. It's by no means the first time that the US-backed right-wing opposition has claimed that there's supposed electoral fraud with no evidence. There's a pattern here. Every time there's an election in Venezuela, this is exactly what happens. And we need to learn from that pattern so we can understand what's happening today.